An appreciation, a sense of gratitude for what do you say, the rarity, preciousness of having this kind of situation where we can do this, which so many different, I don't know if you really reflect on it, all the different alternative scenarios, it almost makes you want to cry. Yeah, so instead of having a pile of books, which everyone expected that I would have who'd seen me talk before, today I just brought one book. It's my security blanket, and I instead had Stephen help me with some handouts, and I'm hoping to go through all of these 3 handouts just in the course of today, and then there'll be some more handouts tomorrow, which I haven't actually finished making yet. So I don't know, how can we give out these? Yeah, let me see. I will make sure I have one, and then I will pass you guys some. So at the top of the first handout, I made a provisional outline of what I was going to try to do with all this time that we have together. And I called it the plan that can be changed, which probably should have said the plan that will change. In fact, I've already changed it from what I wrote here. So I'll just, once you get that, I'll just sort of update you on what I'm thinking prospectively to do. So today, I want to do sort of an introductory talk a little bit, which I'm going to start with, and then an overview of Tsongkhapa's system of Madhyamaka, not everything about his system, like, for example, not his tantric views, but an overview of his interpretation of the view of how things exist, which is the same for him, whether you're talking sutra or tantra, the Madhyamaka view, which he interprets according to Chandrakirti's reading of Nagarjuna. And I'm going to give sort of an overview of that in terms of just getting everybody oriented to what this is, which I think a lot of you already know, but it's worth running over again. And then I'll go into a little more depth and also out onto thin ice in a little bit in trying to posit my own interpretation based on things, which I'll tell you what they are, but it's not with the same degree of certainty, whether it's like, in other words, in the latter part I'll be saying things that different interpreters of Tsongkhapa might have different views about, but this is where I've gotten to. So that's what I wanted to try to do today, and I think then we can have questions in the second part of the class in the afternoon rather than this morning about that, which I would be surprised if it doesn't generate. And then tomorrow, instead of going in the order I was thinking to combine what I have listed here as 3 and 5. So, like, originally I was going to do the backstory of the distinction between different types of interpretation in Nagarjuna before Tsongkhapa, then look at Tsongkhapa, then look at responses to Tsongkhapa's arguments, and then make some sort of evaluation. But now, in trying to actually figure out how to present this, I've moved in the direction of just doing 3 and 5 together as one sort of historical overview of interpretations of Madhyamaka, focusing on the Prasangika Svatantrika distinction and how it came to be, how it was interpreted initially, how it was reinterpreted again and again, and most importantly, how it was reinterpreted by Tsongkhapa. And then after that, have some sort of conclusion or attempt to reflect on what it is we've I forgot, actually, crucial part, number 4, looking at Tsongkhapa's actual arguments and evidence for his interpretation. So number 4 is the part where I get to actually attempting to respond to the request that was the basis for these teachings, which is to try to look at how well justified Tsongkhapa's interpretations of Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti, let's put it that way, are, and that's going to be a difficult part of this. So we're just getting, might seem hard today, but we're just getting warmed up for what we'll be doing by Saturday. And then either, depending on how this works out, then, later on Saturday or on Sunday morning, I can make some sort of conclusions provisionally. Okay, so that's the plan. So I've already said a lot of words that I'm not assuming that everybody knew, but you just have to start somewhere. So actually, this is not all the people that I'm going to name, but these are some of the people that we will make reference to. So the Buddha, we referred to the Buddha 2,500 years ago. So I'm mostly talking about the Buddha as that person rather than our basic nature or our Buddha potential or some other Buddhas. That's what we're talking about. And then Nagarjuna is the crucial person here, because this whole thing is about how to interpret his interpretation of what the Buddha taught, and this sort of key foundational philosophy associated with the great vehicle. And then Buddhapalita was one of, there are 8 maybe major commentaries on Nagarjuna's main treatise on the Middle Way, aside from all his other books. And Buddhapalita is author of one of those commentaries that comes to be significant in this story. And then after Buddhapalita wrote his commentary and trying to explain what Nagarjuna meant about the nature of emptiness and so forth, then Bhavaviveka very soon afterwards criticized it quite sharply in his own commentaries on Nagarjuna, criticizing how Buddhapalita had explained what Nagarjuna meant. And then, shortly after that, this upstart Chandrakirti sort of took Bhavaviveka to task for having criticized Buddhapalita. And this, it seems like it's getting complicated already, but it's just getting started. Basically, Chandrakirti thinks that, Bhavaviveka is making all these rules about how the rules for formulating arguments, and when you want to explain what Nagarjuna said, you have to explain it according to sort of certain kind of systematic logical formula. And that Chandrakirti then argues that Bhavaviveka was really wrong-headed in criticizing Buddhapalita in this way, and that the proper way to formulate arguments is quite different. And Chandrakirti, of course, says a lot of other things. He gives his whole interpretation of Nagarjuna's philosophy, and it's different in other ways besides the issue of argumentation from that of Bhavaviveka. And then not everyone, as we'll see, most people ignore Chandrakirti, and there's this crazy guy over there saying these things. But not everybody. It seems that there had to have been a few people who kept his texts alive, and maybe a few people who read them. But mostly, as we'll see, the evidence suggests that he was largely, that means not entirely ignored. And instead, the interpretation of Nagarjuna's philosophy goes in a new direction, with Madhyamaka scholars, middle way scholars, having to more and more respond to or take into account the Yogacara teachings that were coming to prominence, and figure out what to do, how to understand the, as you say, Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, the unraveling of the Intention Sutra, and then all of the different commentaries in terms of thinking about mind only. And how does middle way philosophy relate to this, and how can it be integrated or not integrated into a middle way aspect of thinking? And then this phase goes on into what we call the first transmission of Buddhism to Tibet, because a couple of these key figures, were involved in reckoning from a Madhyamaka point of view with mind only, were people who established the first monastery in Tibet, Shantarakshita and his disciple Kamalashila, who established the notion of that you should gradually proceed along the path rather than just blotting all conceptions out of your mind as a way to proceed. So then, as we know, Tibet had a little hiccup in terms of the prospering of Buddhism, and when Buddhism was, I don't want to say reestablished, but brought back into flourishing by Atisha, then things had changed, as we'll see, and for various reasons, maybe not fully understood, the Chandrakirti, who had continued to be known but been somewhat seen as a marginal interpreter, came gradually more and more to the fore. And there were people, it flipped, so that there were some people who argued for a Bhava Viveka-like position, but they were in the minority. And the majority, or the fashion, you could say, the philosophical fashion, was blowing the other direction. And it seems that people like Atisha and Jayananda, Patsap, Majja, and then even Sakya Pandita all advocated, really important figures in different ways, as we'll see, advocated for Chandrakirti's way of, or what they took to be Chandrakirti's way of reading Nagarjuna. And you had the minority view, most strongly represented by Chaba Chirgi Senge, that took the opposite view and criticized Chandrakirti and supported Bhava Viveka's approach. And then we have this little hiccup in the 14th century where Sherab Gyaltsen comes up with a totally new, different way of interpreting the great mass of scriptures that had arrived from India, which I've talked about here before, and is not the focus of our explorations, but I just wanted to mention that in the chronology, that the whole history of Madhyamic and Buddhist Tibetan intellectual interpretation of the received tradition is not all about this, Svatantrika versus Prasangika, that Sherab Gyaltsen had a totally different way of putting together things which you could say marginalized this kind of argument over this kind of distinction in favor of a very different distinction between the idea that things are empty of their own essence versus the idea that the ultimate is something that's empty of other coarse, impure phenomena, rather than the ultimate being the sheer absence of self-existence in the things. And although, in our story today, this weekend, that's not in any part of the major lion narrative, it's worth mentioning, as I've mentioned before, that we've come to appreciate that this is not in any way a marginal issue in Tibetan Buddhism today or in the past, that it's quite strong, his views are quite strongly influential on, although rejected by Tsongkhapa and his followers, they're quite strongly influential in both Gagyupa and Nyingma in different ways for different thinkers. And so when we talk today with fellow, practitioners in the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, we have to be aware that a lot of people's idea about what the very word emptiness means can be completely different, and what Madhyamika means could be very different, because they're looking back to Sherab Gyaltsen rather than this lineage of Tsongkhapa and these other people, as we'll be explaining them. Then there were a great number of people who, after Tsongkhapa has his revolutionary interpretation of this tradition, which takes Chandrakirti's side absolutely in these disputes, but interprets what Chandrakirti's side means completely differently from how anybody had before, it would seem, and incorporates into what he takes Chandrakirti's system to be many things that other people had firmly established as being the core views of Bhava Viveka. So, I mean, if you're looking at it coldly from the outside, and this is why I was doing that thing a few years ago where I pretended to be Baba Viveka, patting Tsongkhapa on the head for advocating his system, but calling it Prasangika. I mean, some people looking at the Gelugpa system from the outside think exactly that or worse about what Tsongkhapa has done, that it's called Prasangika, but it's not really what Contradictory was saying. It's an importation of basically ideas that are Baba Viveka-like under the brand of Contradictory. And so, for that reason and many others, probably not all intellectual, Tsongkhapa was subject to some scathing criticisms by a number of different people, including Panchen Shakya Chokden, Mikir Dorje, Daksan Lotsawa, and Koramba. I just put Koramba here as like emblematic of these different critics, you know, from 15th, 16th, 17th century. And of course, Tsongkhapa's followers had passionate rebuttals to offer against these scathing critics. And sometimes it got down to name calling, actually, literally, calling people names. And then it's worth mentioning Mipham, because I'll let you know that the Nyingma participation in arguments about the meaning of Madhyamaka was not as vast or prominent because they weren't focused in the same way on philosophical study. Longchen Rapchan did have a view, and so did Rongzomba early on, and then there wasn't a lot for a long time. And the important person that we can point to in the wake of Tsongkhapa rather than in the period before him is Mipham, who is, you know, one of, as I mentioned before, I think one of the, you know, great luminaries, intellectual luminaries in the history of Tibetan Buddhism. And he has a kind of subtlety and complexity in his system that I don't know, you know, I guess I don't like it as much as Tsongkhapa's personally, but you have to say in kind of the subtlety of his mind and the way he puts things together and what he's trying to do and why he says what he says and all things that he can take into comprehension as he says them, it seems to me that, you know, of the people I have read, it seems to be, you know, on par only with Tsongkhapa. And so interestingly, when you look into what it is that he's doing, it seems that in some ways it can be argued that in a way that's like only, you know, superficially parallel to Tsongkhapa, he's also calling himself a Prasangika while putting under that brand certain sets of ideas that have are not in Contradictory but have been imported from tantric traditions, but also from Svatantrika traditions, in this case not so much from Baba Viveka but more from Shantarakshita. But on the other hand, I should mention that it wasn't like Tsongkhapa's importations into his understanding of Madhyamaka beyond Contradictory were just limited to Baba Viveka or arguably limited to Baba Viveka. He also constantly quotes Kamala Shila on some to back him up on, who's another Svatantrika, to back him up on some of his crucial arguments. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an overview of the kinds of, you know, rough swoop through the history and the kinds of things that we'll be talking about. Now I have a couple of, the next handout is just a few quotations that I wanted to go over by way of introduction to this whole topic. I'm setting a bigger framework for it. The first one is from a text called, Indian text called Bodhicitta Vivarana, which is attributed to Nagarjuna, and which His Holiness the Dalai Lama has firmly stated is by Nagarjuna, and that some Western scholars agree with that and some don't. So I don't know. But anyway, it's a Nagarjuna's text. in which he says, in brief, the Buddha taught that agents, actions, and consequences of actions are, in conventional terms, empty things generated from empty things. In this way, when yogis practice meditating on that emptiness, without a doubt, they grow attached to the well-being of others. Oh, we ran out? Yeah. So I wanted to start with this because there could be a qualm, like, why the heck? What good is it to have such an arcane discussion as foreshadowed by the 25 minutes of talking that I just did? I mean, it's, what's the point? I mean, how does this help anybody? And I guess my general thing that I wanted to say about this is that, we know that in the practice of the path, we need these two aspects. We need to develop compassion, and compassion that's not just like a warm, fuzzy feeling, but a kind of skillful, a skillfully equipped dedication to helping others. And at the same time, we need to have a profound understanding of what the deepest roots of distortion or delusion we have about how things exist. So wisdom and compassion have to work together. And trying to think about that and talk about the different people, I have developed a kind of riff where I just think about, let's call it kindness and honesty. I don't know, I just want to talk about compassion for a minute. I mean, compassion's an English word. We almost take it as though it were not. Actually, the Buddha never said the word compassion. let's just take that thought to mind for a minute. So that's an English word, right? So, the Sanskrit word is karuna, and the Tibetan word is nyingche. And so nyingche, nying means heart, and je means the very best. Like we say, Tsongkhapa is je Rinpoche, the foremost precious one. So nyingche means like the very best kind of heart that one could have, which presumably is where His Holiness the Dalai Lama got the idea of having a book called The Good Heart. Good heart is like the heart of compassion, but it's like if you call it the good heart, you're actually we're literally translating into English the Tibetan word for compassion. The very best kind of heart that one could have. Compassion, our word, English, compassion, which the Buddha never said, means to feel for, to have, a strong feeling for or with someone else, right? And so it has more of an affective quality, and more intensely, and associated with that kind of emotional responsiveness that we feel when we see someone else suffering, right? Or that's hope that we do, right? In neuroscience now they talk about this in terms of mirror neurons, that if somebody in here starts yawning, then the other people will yawn. If people smile, other people just automatically smile, right? Yeah, and if someone's hurting, then we have a part of our brain that like mirrors that pain, and we feel it in a secondary way, but in a real way within ourselves. So that's, I don't know, that's how I kind of think about, I'm not divorcing myself from the word compassion, but that's kind of the direction it goes, is this sort of empathetic responsiveness. And it's like karuna, the Sanskrit word, is suggests something more active than that. That it kind of so it's a secondary derivative of the verb for to act. So it implies loving care or active kind of care, and as opposed to implying a sentimental response, which I'm not trying to deprecate, but I'm just saying it's a different kind of thing. And it may not unrelated, but distinct kind of thing. That's the right way to say it. So, we were talking about this a little bit in New Jersey, where I was teaching recently, and Jay was saying, well, we really need emptiness to purify the sentimentality out of our compassion for others, and maybe not even think of it as compassion. But think of it as, that we have it almost begins to sound like a dispassionate loving care, or almost a coldly calculating beneficence. Like if we really see there are no living beings out there, and I'm going to save them anyway, then you start, right? When the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras say exactly that, they say exactly that. It's not like Edward Kanza made it up, which one could think. It's right in the sutra. So, I don't know, so then we had this Zen master there, Sandy Gente, and he said, well, it's just natural to have both, and we need both. We need, we want to, as human beings, we have, we do feel for others, and we don't want to say that needs to be refuted. But there is a kind of way in which what we think of as compassion is certainly contaminated, to put it in a kind of technical sense, or influenced by aspects of attachment and sentimentality and partiality, which is one of the biggest problems, right? Of course, and it's not just that the Buddhists say this; it's also the neuroscientists now. It's like people have this mirror neuron response, but they only have it to people they see as one of us. And then if you have somebody, say, who's a Republican and you're a Democrat, then you give them a shock and the brain doesn't light up the same way. Which is like, forget about like different races or people with, from different countries. It's just, if you see someone who's being on the other side of any kind of like boundary in your mind, then you don't have the same kind of responsiveness to them. And when you realize that, oh yeah, that's confirmed by science, that's the way our brain works, and you go back and look at the way the system we have for, cultivating universal compassion, begins with trying to break down that sense of partiality, which is like, I'd rather not bother with that part so much, and move on to wishing well for all beings. But it's like, well, it doesn't really work. You always remain biased toward the people that you feel like are the ones close to you, and like you. Anyway, unless you work on that first. So I think that's just an example, maybe, of how wisdom and compassion need to fit together. And by wisdom here, I mean honesty of seeing things clearly, not necessarily just wisdom understanding emptiness, but seeing things realistically. Seeing things realistically and then extending loving care to others are mutually reinforcing and supporting and synergistic and purifying. Like, you don't want to have, like, yesterday I was talking about how people might really want to help others, but actually harm them because they're merely well-meaning. We use that phrase, well-meaning, in English to sort of as cast aspersions on someone who's utterly inept and isn't bothering to try to figure out what a skillful way to help is, right? Yeah, well-meaning is definitely a put-down, although it doesn't sound like it should be, right? Because you have such good intentions. That's like, there's some kind of negation, right? That's like already implicit, right? So, yeah, I think at the conventional level, wisdom works at the conventional level to shape our care into something skillful, into, upaya, we say, skill and liberative technique, so that it's not just A, feeling warm and fuzzy, and B, ineptly blundering around and congratulating ourselves on caring. You have to look at things realistically and see what might actually be helpful as best you can figure it out with the amount of wisdom you have. Yeah. Okay, well, I could say more about that, but maybe that's gives you a general idea that I think. I guess I want to say one more thing. Is that so when we cultivate? Yeah, it's implicit in this that when we cultivate a sense of loving care for others, that one of the crucial ways to eliminate our sense of bias, is to recognize that all beings are fundamentally equal, they're equal at the conventional level and all wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, and ultimately they're all equally empty of existing as they appear. That having this kind of understanding of emptiness has a kind of purifies. That's I guess what I've been trying to say. It purifies our compassionate motivation. So the point of all that was to get to saying, look, if you don't understand emptiness accurately, then there's a subtle fault left even in your compassion at some level, because your compassion is associated with an element of reification or distortion, because you're not actually seeing the world realistically. Anyway, that's what I wanted to suggest. So, let's look, before we go into the question of exactly what the right way to understand emptiness or have the right kind of wisdom is, I wanted to look at this last quote on the second hand I gave out from the Samadhi Raja Sutra. And this gives you a sense of what Tsongkhapa is going to, and this is our main project for today, is talk about Tsongkhapa's system. This is how Tsongkhapa is going to present what we're supposed to be doing in order to gain profound wisdom. He quotes this one verse from the Samadhi Raja Sutra 3 times in the course of the 3rd volume of the great treatise. Second 2 times he quotes it, he just says ... or the Tibetan equivalent of ... But it's like he refers 3 times to the exact same verse, which is something I found out by reading this more than once, and then it's very clear that there's no other sutra, there's no other passage that in the course of one treatise that he quotes 3 separate times like that. And it's like a really important thing to him, obviously. If you analytically discern the lack of self in phenomena, and if you cultivate that very analysis in meditation, then this will cause the result, attainment of nirvana, and it's supposed to say no peace, sorry, there's a few typos in here. There is no peace through any other means. So, so if you analytically discern, that means that following Nagarjuna, Bhavaviveka, Kamalashila, that Tsongkhapa is going to strongly emphasize that wisdom begins with a process of conceptual analysis, reasoning. People who don't know very much about Buddhism tend to think that Buddhism is the opposite of reasoning. But not only that, there's also a lot of people who do know a lot about Buddhism who have the firm conviction that Buddhism is the opposite of being about reasoning. And we'll be talking about that. That is, that their view is that to know emptiness is to transcend any kind of conceptual thought, especially any kind of like systematic analytical thought, right? And go into some kind of like state or dimension that's beyond any such reasoning. And it's not like that this isn't like completely false. It's not that this is completely false, as we'll see, but it's really misleading. If you analytically discern, so you have to begin, in order to attain nirvana, according to Samadhi Raja Sutra, you have to begin with analysis. You have to use analysis to investigate how things exist. And when you use this analysis, you will discern, come to know, figure out, cognize, an absence, that is the lack, an absence, a specific, but not just the lack of existence or the lack of phenomena. It doesn't say you'll discern the absence of phenomena. So you'll discern a particular kind of lack. You'll, through analysis, arrive at knowledge of a negative, and that negation is of a very specific object of negation called self, as pertains to the base of all phenomena. Okay, so in that one line, he's like basically getting his whole, he can distill from that one line, just the first line of that, his whole idea about how we're supposed to, start, at least on the wisdom side of the path. And then he says, if you cultivate that very analysis, I mean, Tsongkhapa doesn't make up these words, it says that in the sutra. If if you call it that very analysis in meditation, that means you don't just start by meditation by withdrawing from analysis or conceptuality and say, oh, all these things are very confusing, let me set my mind on the void, right? But you have to start by going into things and saying, what is a table? What is a person? You know, what is a cup? What is a chair? And you have to wrestle with these difficulties, right, until you get to a point of seeing that there's nothing graspable there, and then realize, oh yeah, but nonetheless the cup is able to function. And how is that? The cup must not be the way I thought it was, because it's able to function, even though when I go and look for it, I can't find it. And it's that understanding that you arrive at through analysis. That exact understanding is the thing that you focus your mind on in meditation. The reason it's important is because some people will say, oh yeah, you should do this analysis. But when you come to the analysis, then you're beyond all objects of meditation. You transcend any point of mental focus. And what Tsongkhapa is saying, well, that's not what the Samadhi Raja Sutra says. It says when you reach this certain understanding that things are, that there's this lack or absence, you know, that you know directly, this lack or absence that we call emptiness, of this exaggerated self means this exaggerated kind of existence, that it's that object, that lack, that you meditate on, not nothing, not the absence of, you know, any ideas, but that specific absence is what you meditate on. And that's how you realize nirvana. So, and there isn't any other way to realize nirvana according to this sutra. So, I think if you just focus on the first two lines, especially, you can see it's like pretty much, you know, the gist of all of Tsongkhapa's special insight part of the great treatise, his first, you know, big text, is kind of can be, I don't know, I've started to form this idea that his whole book is like a commentary on these first two lines of these four, and that's why he keeps quoting them. Anyway, so what is this? That it's important to be accurate in discerning the lack of self, as I was saying, so that we don't have some residual confusion in the way we, or distortion in the way we apprehend things, including the beings for whom we're being compassionate. Aryadeva, who, skipping up to the second quote, who is a direct disciple of Nagarjuna, says, seeing what is not emptiness as if it were emptiness, some people say, I will attain nirvana, but actually they won't. The Tathagatas have said that you do not reach nirvana through wrong views. So, in other words, you have to be very precise. You can't just like say, oh, I realize emptiness. If you're wrong about, you know, you're calling emptiness something that isn't the actual profound lack of self in phenomena, the subtlest. If we have some residual distortion in the way we see things, we haven't negated the subtlest level of distortion, then you don't attain liberation. And so this is, I'm trying to get to the point of saying that the crucial thing is to, when it says you analytically discern the lack of self, well, you have to like know what this hypothetical self is that we are grasping onto, and by which way of which we're trapped in cyclical existence. You have to know it really accurately, because if you don't know, that we call it identifying the object of negation. If you don't identify it very precisely and accurately, then you will refute either too much and be, you know, slipping into nihilism, or too little and remain trapped in cyclic existence. By the way, I'm really trying to remember to say cyclic existence instead of cyclic existence, because when you say cyclic existence, everybody thinks you mean sickly existence, or everybody is like, and cyclic is of course a better way to say it so that people understand, but I'm just not used to it. So anyway, Tsongkhapa, I just pulled out a few little quotes from Tsongkhapa that are, you know, following from my point of view on the quote from Aryadeva. Chandrakirti commented on Nagarjuna's intention using Buddhapalita as a basis, but he also took many good explanations from Baba Viveka while refuting those that seemed a little inaccurate. So this is kind of a crucial thing. It's like he's going to say, yeah, Chandrakirti, according to Tsongkhapa, is relying upon and incorporating Baba Viveka's ideas, and therefore I, Tsongkhapa, will incorporate and rely upon Baba Viveka's ideas up to a point. right? But the crucial point is that, like, at some point, a little inaccurate. If you're a little inaccurate in your identification of the object of negation, then you don't attain nirvana, right? Let alone Buddhahood, right? So, I mean, it's really interesting to notice how this goes back and forth. That, like Chandrakirti, as we'll see, when he's talking about, Bhavaviveka without naming him, he says, well, no one else has accurately explained what Nagarjuna said. And if you rely upon other people, then there isn't any comparison, their explanation and mine, because just as there's no comparison between a mundane view and a supramundane view. So, in other words, all other Madhyamaka all other efforts, that means Bhavaviveka, to explain what Nagarjuna meant, are not going to get you free from cyclic existence, and that's what he means by there being mundane views. So that, in other words, the implication is that there are some Madhyamakas through whom, following thoroughly, we will not attain nirvana at all. And they're still called Madhyamakas, by Tsongkhapa and everybody else, mostly. They're not, kicked out of the Madhyamaka classification, but because there's this little bit of inaccuracy, a miss is as good as a mile in terms of whether you escape cyclic existence or not. That's the implication. So refuting the object negation in this way is not an idle pursuit. That means identifying it and refuting, because you see that living beings are bound in cyclic existence by a wrong conceptual consciousness that has the object of negation as its object, and then you refute that object. And you should do this relying on the prasangika position. So if you make a mistake, then you aren't able to help out liberate other beings or yourself. So anyway, that is, I guess all this is by way of why this is important. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, it's a subtle, difficult thing. It's not a beginner's thing. But in the long run, if we want to know accurately just what Tsongkhapa's system is about, what it is we have to understand in order to achieve awakening, to become awakened, to awaken, then we have to sort this out at some point. So the view is not something that about this lack of self was, of course, not something that Nagarjuna was making up. And one of the really famous passages that and is quoted in Venerable Chödrön's book about this is from the Pali Suttas, where Mara is engaging in a dialogue with Vajira Bhikkhuni, and she rebukes Mara, saying, "Why now do you assume a being? Is that your speculative view? This is a heap of sheer formations, and here no being is found." It's just like an assemblage of parts. The word, when there's an assemblage of certain kinds of parts, we use the word chariot. And like that, when the aggregates of mind and body are present, then there's a convention, or then you could say it's appropriate to use the convention, a being. So, that's everybody. All these people will agree that that's a profound teaching. It goes back, before Nagarjuna, and the question is, how do we exactly understand that? What does that exactly mean? And there's lots of different kinds of interpretations. For example, one kind of interpretation that you could make of this is which is not the correct one, but it seems plausible on the face of this, is that there's a twofold ontology here. That in the last two lines of the first stanza, she says, "This is a heap of stuff. There is no being found." So there's two kinds of things. There's the stuff that's there, and then there's the imaginary construct of a person that's laid on top of it. And she doesn't say there's no stuff here, and then on top of that no stuff, you impute some other thing that isn't really there. No, she doesn't say that. So it certainly allows the interpretation that there are some real things that are foundational, to our way of to existence. And the problem isn't that we think that there are real things at all. The problem is that in relationship to these real things, like quarks or dharmas or whatever we take to be fundamentally, there's some fundamentally real thing, but we never get in contact with those things. Instead, we have these interactions with these imaginary constructs like people and tables and battleships and so forth, which are just names that are applied to certain kinds of temporary configurations, right? But configurations of what? Configurations of aggregates, or configurations of dharmas, or configurations of atoms or quarks, or whatever you take as foundational. I just want to point that out because the wording, very clearly does allow or even invite, to some extent, that kind of reading. And it's clear that some people in the Buddhist tradition did exactly make that kind of reading, right? Yeah. So just as with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used. So in other words, there's the convention or designation chariot that we apply in relationship to some kind of appropriate collection of parts. And it's just like that we talk about a person in relationship to the aggregates of mind and body. So the person is, the chariot is empty of being naturally from its own side, set up as a chariot. It depends on us looking at this collection of parts and saying, chariot, to be a chariot. And it's like that with the person. It's not like there's this natural personhood. Actually, a lot of people right, that we feel that we have a kind of natural personhood, and probably could develop a philosophy or theology of personhood and so forth, founded around the idea that the essence of all people is their fundamental personness, right? Or something like that. Yeah. So I don't want to try to explain everything and that we can. There's a lot. You could just have the whole thing on this verse, but I just want to introduce you to the idea that this notion of things being unfindable under analysis, and the crucial thing being this overcoming this distorted idea of an exaggerated sense of a real person there, or a real table or real chair. If you care about chariots, then you might get your hands off my chariot. Then at that time, there's a real chariot there, not just a pile of chariot stuff that somebody's put a label on, right? Yeah. There you go. Okay. So I just wanted to make that point, and now I want to what I'm going to do now is explain Tsongkhapa's view to you in two phases. One is based on first phase is based on some of the quintessential points that appear at the back. I'm sorry, I'm giving more on the left side than the right, so in the back we'll probably have to get some across. The first part I have a high degree of confidence about, because that is a high degree of confidence that these represent Tsongkhapa's view, because they're based very directly on reading and rereading and reading with teachers Tsongkhapa's actual book and studying his ideas for a long time. So I'm just going to say in this first part, which is page 1, key points of Tsongkhapa's view, I'm just going to say things about which I have a fairly high degree of confidence, which is different from direct realization, but just what I'm saying is how high confidence that this is Tsongkhapa's view. All right, and then since that will not explain everything, I'm going to explain things that I started explaining here last year, actually when Venerable Chödrön wasn't here, and have been trying to work on since, to try to say, not just from my own creation, but based on reading things that His Holiness has read and other teachers, what it is that this view means. And I know that not everybody agrees with it, and I have a low degree of confidence that it's completely right. But I don't know, it feels like this is what we have to do, is try to actually work with these ideas and not just say, oh, I'm faithful to them. You have to put yourself out there and try to say, this is what I think it means. And just like I was saying yesterday about grief, and helping people, you probably be wrong sometimes. But if you don't put it out there, then you don't find out. Yeah. So, first of all, key points of Tsongkhapa's Madhyamaka view. There's nothing that can bear ultimate analysis. That is, everything, when interrogated as to the fundamental conditions of its existence, is unfindable. So, I'm going to explain that, but before I explain that, I just wanted to have a brief side note about what we call tenet systems. So this is Tsongkhapa's interpretation of the Madhyamaka view, which is his interpretation of one particular tenet system, Trumta or Siddhanta in Sanskrit, Trumta in Tibetan. And in English, scholars refer to this genre as doxography. That means writing that compiles systems of things that people believe systematically. So you have systems like, here's what if you did a Christian doxography, it would be, here's what the Southern Baptists believe, and here's what the Methodists believe, and here's what the Episcopalians believe, and something like that. And you could have a book where you read, here are the tenets. It would be very convenient, right? Not to be mystified. So you can see that's a valuable thing if you're interested in moving around in a certain landscape, or thinking about, say you're a Catholic and you want to try to understand your doctrine in relationship to other purportedly Christian doctrines, right? Then you could use a book like that. And that's exactly why it developed in the Tibetan tradition. And not just in the Tibetan tradition, it goes back to India. Some people say that Bhava Viveka might have been the first person to write a book that we can identify as this sort of thing. Other people did it in India. And then people did it very early on in Tibet, like during the first transmission of the Dharma to Tibet. There were already people who said, here's all this stuff coming in, how do we make how do we classify it, and how do we rank these different classifications so that we know which is the highest view? This becomes extremely important in the Tibetan tradition, and it's become so important that it's been a target of a lot of criticism from Western scholars, I would say, basically, who their problem is that people don't actually read Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti or Shandarakshita or Kamalashila. They just read someone who tells them what Tsongkhapa said that those other people said, and they already know what they're saying is supposed to mean before they read it, because they know where it fits in the tenet system. And that is a problem. It is actually hard to go and read Chandrakirti nakedly, in some sense, once you already know what it is that Tsongkhapa thinks that he means. Do you know what I'm saying? It is true. And on the other hand, there's just the mass of confusing sutras and shastras and systems, and people have to have some way to get oriented and a place to start. And I also think that people, I don't know, it's like a map. All right, Jeffrey calls his big book on tenet system Maps of the Profound. That's a very carefully chosen term. Like, a map is not the actual terrain. There's a difference if we have a map of all the trails on the mountain, which we don't. But if we had a map, it would still not be the same as going up on the mountain, right? We could sit down here and study the map. Where does Snow Diamond go? And so forth, like that. It would not be the same as actually going out on the trail. And it's, when you create these schemas, it has a simplification. If you have a classification scheme, you have to, at some point, you don't have a limit. You can't make a classification for every single book by every single author. So sometimes you have to simplify things or finesse differences a little bit to get people into slots. And that's kind of a complaint. And Khensur Yeshe Thupten, one of our teachers, said that for students of Buddhism who have faith in emptiness but have no understanding of it, these tenet systems are really important, and that one should study them in ascending order, not starting with what we're doing today. In other words, and he said this method guards against students having undermined their confidence in dependent arising, that is, that things exist and what they do makes a difference. The concern, and he's just echoing something that's implicit in the whole Gelugpa educational system traditionally, is that you can't just take 14-year-old kids and start out by saying, look, nothing really exists. And ultimately, there's no difference between right and wrong. Is that skillful? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? That's not maybe very skillful. So yeah, it's like, well, maybe we should start with something else, and then we'll work around to, the idea of nothing ultimately existing. Yeah, so that the idea is that you're not supposed to teach emptiness to people to whom it's harmful. And it's very difficult, not being clairvoyant, to know when one's doing that. One could be on the safe side and never talk about it at all. And there certainly seem to be some teachers who've adopted that approach. Yeah, it's difficult. His Holiness, of course, does talk about emptiness, but he doesn't talk about it equally or in the same way to everybody. And when we all saw him there at Lehigh, he was joking about how, he talked about emptiness, but he also talked a lot about how belief in God was so important for Christians. And then he didn't just say that, he articulated this heartfelt understanding of why, that you looking at a divine creator is like a parent, and then you really want to do what the parent wants you to do because you love the parent and the parent loves you, and then you try to find the right way to live and care for others in the world. And it's like, oh, that's the key point for His Holiness. They have a doctrine that helps them care for others in the world. Who cares whether it's right or wrong? For the time being, what we want to do is have other people believe things that will help them care more for other people in the world. So then, when people invite him to teach the Bible, he used arguments for the existence of God that he didn't believe in, but to support in a skillful way what he thought would be helpful for those people in that context. And then other time there, he joked about telling his Christian friends that they should borrow anything they want from Buddhism, but not to read about emptiness. Just do the patience is fine, mindfulness, compassion is all good, but you have to be. There has to be a little caveat around the emptiness box. May be harmful to your belief in God, which is the foundation for your idea that you should, be nice. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I was starting to say, first point. This isn't the very first. This is the first point that I'm going to explain here. If you look in the back, this is all from the back of Introduction to Emptiness, my book, which tries to distill into some number of points, Tsongkhapa's view. And I just didn't put all of the points. I just put some that seem relevant to what we're doing here. So there isn't anything that can hold up under ultimate analysis. That means that when you say of anything, table, chair, person, atom, Buddha, what is it really? There isn't anything in the end that you come to that's you can grab hold of that answers that question. Oh, a Buddha is really this truth body, or the Buddha is really this form body. There isn't in the end anything that can be pinned down as the essence of the person, the core of the person. So there's lots of this is crucial point, right? And it's pretty much everything else is founded upon the idea that all Madhyamikas, this isn't some unique Tsongkhapa system. All the Madhyamikas hold this, and it goes back to Nagarjuna and before. As in, we just looked at the Vajira Bhikkhuni passage. So like when you search among the parts of things, like the parts of a chariot or the parts of a person, like you've got brain cells and lymph fluid, and gallbladder is in there, and pancreas, and then you have like subjective awareness, we call it mind or consciousness, which is flickering and changing moment to moment. It has different aspects to it, right? And then so you have all these like mental and physical parts, and like which one is me, right? So it's like if the brain is me, then my brain should be able to do stuff. Yeah, and then you still have even that, which seems like a problem already. But even if you say, oh well, my brain could be in a vat and I would still feel like me, which part of your brain is you? It was already, Man, if you keep going like that, you can't actually, maybe it's your pineal gland, this is like if somebody has said something, oh, find this little part in there, it's like, that's the soul right there, right? And it seems like you're not going to find the person as any one part, in the collection of stuff that we call the person. And you don't find it as like the collection as a whole either, because you can have all the parts individually, like of a chariot, for example, and you can like line them up and say, here's the complete collection. It's like, I always use the example of ordering a bookcase, right? You can get the bookcase from Kmart or whatever. Here's your bookcase. I saw the bookcase on the floor. Now I have this box of bookcase parts, and it doesn't hold any books. So it has a complete collection. We'll assume that it was all the parts were put in there. Maybe sometimes there's a screw missing, but it's assuming that all the parts are there. It's still not a bookcase yet, And so then you say, well, it's like you have to have the parts arranged in the right order. Well, you have the shape of the book. You have the shape of the bookcase there without actually being a bookcase, and people make holograms of bookcases or paper mache bookcases that don't hold books, and so it's not the shape of the bookcase, it's the book. Like we can make a model of a car out of clay and it still doesn't. So you have all these problems that you just have to keep thinking, is like, well, what exactly is it? Or if you think forests obviously exist because when people are getting lumber out of them, but then when you go and look at them closely, you can't actually find the forest part of the forest, the part in the forest that makes the forest the forest. There's all these non-foresty things in there. Little rocks and lichens and miscellaneous bits, right? There's some little chipmunks, and it's like, yeah, but where's the forest? You can't find the forest in the forest. It's just over there. It's like at the end of Jeffrey always says, it's the end of my finger when I point at it. Yeah. So anyway, people do these kinds of analysis that I'm doing sort of informally, but the idea that you can't find the thing that you're designating or calling a person, or you can't find the person or the chariot or the forest either among its parts or as a collection of parts or separate from it. It's not some other independent thing, which some people could think. Like that there's a real me that's separate from my mind and body and independent of them, just floating around, like I'm here, my mind and body are here with you, but actually I'm still down in Shanti at the cabin. Because the real me is not my mind or my body, as I just established, and there is a me, so it doesn't have to be here, right? Yeah, and so that seems absurd, right? We don't see any way to. Well, you can have further. Some people might actually argue that, right? But anyway, so you analyze in that way. You can't really find among the parts or apart from the parts the thing, and that's the idea of ultimate analysis. There are other kinds of ultimate analytical reasonings. There's Tsongkhapa has a whole book of them, and then Contradictory has more, and everybody has. Some of the Svatantrikas contribute their own arguments. So you have this large number of arguments, and the idea is that with, like, for example, you say production, that things is when something we think that things definitely arise. But does an existent thing come in? Things are either existent or non-existent. So what is it that arises, an existent thing or a non-existent thing? And then you quickly realize there's a problem, because if it already exists, it doesn't need to come into existence. If it's non-existent, what does it mean to say that it's arising? It doesn't exist. It can't be doing this activity arising. Or then there's another one saying, like, are things like generated from self, other, both, or neither? Right? It's like definitely generated from other. Yeah, those are like the way, I tend to think it's like, well, one thing comes from another. Doesn't Buddha teach dependent arising? This arises dependent on that, and this and that are not the same. They're other than each other, and therefore things must arise from other. Pow! Right? No, but it's like, no, when you say other, right, it's like there's like this thing and there's that thing over there. Like, there's all these different kinds of things. Like the world is classified by the mind into this and this and this and this and this. And like if this thing over here is going to produce that thing over there, then like how does it do that? It's apart from it. It's separate. It has a different nature, a different location, and different space. If things that are really like have separate bases or separate natures are able to like somehow, make and the other one come into existence, something that's actually different or really different, we'll say, then you have this problem that anything could produce anything, essentially. Like, why do you need, light, a flame, a flashlight to make it light? You could use darkness to make it light and so forth. Or why do you need a match to light a fire? You could use an ice cube just as well, because something that's other can produce something else. So so once you see those, like, well, some things can't. It's like we know that things arise and they rise in relationship to other things, but when we try to pin down how that works, like whether things arising from things that are the same as them or things that are actually different from them, we find it difficult to pin down. When you think about it, it's like I've become conscious. It's like if you plant a seed and then you actually watch it grow. It's like, I'm going to catch it becoming a sprout, right? And it's like, well, yeah. It's like, well, it's not exactly like the way our mind, is categorizing things or imagining them to be the way they're actually related. And so there's this slippery quality to things that and the problem is that our way of thinking about things isn't attuned to that slipperiness or fluidity or interconnectedness. Instead, it chops things up into blocks that, in our case, we associated with concepts and language, and then we take those as being the actual things that are really there. When you try to explain how they work, it doesn't make any sense, and you're like, Okay, so that's what it means in a rough way to say there's nothing that can bear ultimate analysis, like the Nagarjuna analyzes the Buddha. Anything, when you analyze it, is unfindable. So then we think that means that, they're using reason, they can't find things, that must mean that things don't exist. Actually, lots of people have reached that conclusion. If a reasonable, philosophical, analytical mind looks for something, it can't find it, what could that mean other than that thing doesn't exist? It almost seems like an irresistible conclusion. What's the point of doing the analysis except to see, whether that thing is really there or not? And when you look to see whether it's really there and you don't find it, doesn't that mean that it isn't there? I mean, do you know what I'm saying? If you look for a pot and it's like you don't find the pot, then you would say that means the pot isn't there where you look for it. So it seems like that's very easy to think that and reach the conclusion that this Nagarjuna is a nihilist, and he's basically proved that although it seems that things exist, they don't exist at all, in fact, because when you look for them, you can't find them. So Tsongkhapa is really clear that this is not the case, and he makes a really important distinction, which I think is like, people say, well, the crucial distinction for Tsongkhapa is distinguishing inherent existence from existence, which it is. But what does that mean? It means this, that when you don't find something by analyzing it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means it doesn't exist in any way such as to be found when an ultimate mind asks of it, what is it really? That's really, it's like, that's amazing, right? To figure that out. Things don't have any way of existing that answers to the question, what is it really? What is the real nature of the potato, or something like that? And we can't find it when we look for it, and that doesn't refute its existence. It still exists anyway. It just exists in a way that's totally different from how we'd expect it or imagine. It exists without being findable under analysis. And so, that's that implies just the same, the distinction between inherent existence and existence. If something had existed in and of itself or had its own essential nature, then you would find that when you looked under ultimate analysis. So the fact that things can't be found under an ultimate analysis is another way of saying that they have no existence such as can be found under an ultimate analysis, means that they have no essential nature. That's what you would find. It's essence. Things are essenceless. Nonetheless, they exist anyway and can function. The lack of findability in things, or lack of findability in things is an indication that they have no essential nature, and this lack of essential nature is their emptiness. So the fact that things exist and can function at the same time not existing at all in the way what we usually take exist to mean is the middle way, as Tsongkhapa lays it out. It's like, in one way of looking at things, to say, this is a table, this is a clock, this is Guy. These are correct distinctions conventionally. But then there's another way of looking at things where you say, what is this really, what is this really, what is this really? And in each case you come only to emptiness. And then Tsongkhapa's system is that these are both correct. and that this is not a contradiction or a paradox, according to Tsongkhapa. It's simply, and this is his example, like the difference between seeing and hearing, or maybe not quite simply, but it is analogous. We can use the example of seeing and hearing, that we don't see sounds no matter how carefully we look. Does not prove the non-existence of sounds. It proves the non-existence of sounds. Sounds non-existence in such a way as to be seeable. Right? And that's like when we look in a certain way, don't find something, means it doesn't exist in such a way as to be found when looking in that way. Yeah. So that's seeing and hearing. That really helped me understand that, like, conventional knowledge and ultimate knowledge, that things are ultimately empty but conventionally exist as this and that, are not paradoxically related, but it's two ways of looking at the world, which are both they're distinct but both valid. We need to get reliable information from both of these kinds of ways of knowing in Tsongkhapa's system. We need both of them on the path. Like, hypothetically, suppose that you only, this would actually be impossible, because how would you ever realize emptiness if you didn't have any conventional knowledge of reasoning or examples or objects that are empty? But hypothetically, right, if you if you only knew emptiness, then you would just go, I'm not sure about other stuff, but I know these things are empty. Then how could you make you function? How would you eat? How would you decide what to do? It's like, when you say, well, should I do this or that? Well, this is empty, but on the other hand, this is empty. And it would be like the same, like that. There was no way to know, whether to kill or not to kill, or whether, do you see what I'm saying? There's no way to distinguish virtue from non-virtue when you're looking at things only from point of view of their ultimate nature. Tsongkhapa is really, really emphatic about this point, that, absolutely we need ultimate realization to be liberated. But you have to understand that it doesn't discredit conventional knowledge that allows us to make the distinctions that we need to develop the compassion side of the path. So that's super important. Nothing exists ultimately because all things lack any intrinsic nature such as would be findable under analysis. Point 5 is redundant with other things that I've said. And then point 6, our senses are deceived about how things exist. Very important. Things appear to them as though they were essentially real, objectively, independently established by way of their own character, as though they were set up from their own side as this or that, but they aren't. Nothing exists, even conventionally, in the exaggerated way that things falsely appear to our senses. So this is a super important point. As we'll see, this is a point that Tsongkhapa uses to make a distinction between the two types of Madhyamaka. He takes this as being Chandrakiri's view, but not Bhavaviveka's view. So Bhavaviveka, everything else I've said so far, basically, Bhavaviveka, Chandrakiri, Tsongkhapa are all together on that nothing's ultimately findable and so forth. But this question of, okay, well, but how do things appear to our minds? Do we have a false, do things actually appear to our senses as already as though they existed in and of themselves? Or is there like a way in which our senses have some kind of correct appearance, but then there's a kind of conceptual distortion on top of that sense data? And Tsongkhapa's view is that Chandrakirti's interpretation is that even at the pre-conceptual level, that just at the level of sense appearance, the appearance of a sound or the appearance of a color or a shape, that already we have this like appearance of these things as naturally being what they, that is, by naturally means that like they have their own distinctive character, like from their own side, as this or that. And so in that way, in Tsongkhapa's view, which follows Chandrakirti here, all of information that we have about the world is contaminated by this false appearance. We don't have any uncontaminated information because it all has this overlay of false appearance. And so from that you could conclude that, well, we're just in a mess here. we go Pure Land route, put our faith in the Lama or put our faith in Buddha and just hope, because we don't know anything, right? Because all of our senses, all of our minds are contaminated with this reifying appearance. And that could be a conclusion, in fact not only could be, but has been a conclusion that some people have reached. But Tsongkhapa doesn't reach that. He makes this move of saying, look, our senses are contaminated with this false appearance, but even so, they can still be reliable sources of information at the same time that they have this distortion. And that's like, super subtle move, distinct. It's like part of the genius, right, at work. Like, I use the example I made up to explain this in the book is thinking of someone who's colorblind. A person who's colorblind may have a actually false, distorted appearance of how the traffic light looks. It doesn't mean they don't have any information about whether there is a light there, or whether the top light's lit or the bottom light's lit, or whether the sun is shining. I mean, they know a lot of stuff that's reliable, but they know it in a distorted way because they can't distinguish red from green. Okay? So if you substitute existence and inherent existence for red and green, and imagine that we're all colorblind, right, all the time, and cannot tell the difference, and everything that's exists at all appears to us as inherently existent, and we just take that to be what it means to exist because we've always seen it that way, and everyone we know has always seen it that way. Then you get this idea of what our situation is like, and it's not helpless. It's not the same as being utterly helpless. You still have a lot of information about what's around you. You just see it in this distorted way. So yeah, it's sort of like the problem is like, if someone were colorblind, is there a process by which they could deduce their own colorblindness? Right? I mean, I just thought of that, so I don't worked it out. But like, that's the idea. It's like we have all this reliable information, but can we use that and put that together, considering that we also have this distortion, in such a way as to figure out that this distortion has to be taking place? That's essentially what Tsongkhapa is saying. Yeah, we have every time when I see a cup, I'm getting accurate information that this is a cup, and yet also I'm seeing it in a false way, as though it were naturally a cup from its own side. Well, how am I going to figure out that I have this distortion? Well, it's not magic. You have to use reasoning and figure out, like, well, it looks like it's naturally a cup from its own side, but could that really be the case? If that were the case, then da-da-da-da-da, and does that seem to be, and that's how you do analysis, is see whether your perception is, logically sustainable. So that's the crucial thing. Emptiness exists, like it's a sheer absence of intrinsic nature. We call it the ultimate because when we ask of anything, what is it really? We come at last to emptiness, or this lack of any findable essence. So emptiness isn't like on a different plane. It is also empty, like everything else. It exists only conventionally and dependently. So you can think about that in one level is that emptiness is not just a free-floating noumena or something like that. It's a quality of this and this. Like, they're always saying, where is emptiness? Well, it's here and here and here and here and here. It's the quality of each thing that we turn our minds to, of lacking the kind of essential nature that we think the thing has. And so it exists in relationship to emptiness is a quality of something, like green. In a sense, it's like there's green, that something is green, and then we form the concept green in relationship to things that have the quality of being green, like those meditation cushions in the back. So emptiness is like that. It depends on something being empty. It also depends on a mind, that says, well, this unfindability of things when I analyze them is what we will call emptiness, and so forth. So it doesn't exist in of itself more than anything else does. So being empty, all things exist interdependently, dependent arisings. They don't exist in and of themselves. It can't be found as having their own essence, but they do exist. They exist as dependent arisings. And this means, as like in some cases of many types of objects, we think about that they are impermanent objects. They arise in dependence upon causes and conditions, like Sravasti Abbey is not just here in and of itself, right? Then there's all these different causes and conditions have to come together. And like a cup isn't just here in and of itself because it depends on the handle of the cup and the top half of the cup. Jeffrey's doing the top half of the cup and the bottom half of the cup. Also, I think important for me is this part of the cup right down here that keeps the, and so there's all these different parts of the cup. And like it doesn't just be, you can't just be a cup like in a unitary independent way. It's like dependent upon these parts, right? But it's not just like the parts can assemble themselves and constitute them as a cup, like just working together. Let's team up. No, it's like when a certain kind of collection of parts is there in a certain way, what happens? We go cup. So a cup is something that's imputed or designated by the mind in relationship to certain kinds of collections. This is where we start to get into it, right? The object of imputation, that is the cup, the person, cannot be found either among or apart from its basis of imputation. This is like this really important point. Tsongkhapa claims, and we'll be looking at the evidence for it, that everyone else, except for the Contradictory-based system, believes that in the end, although, things don't exist ultimately. They exist conventionally because we're, Madhyamaka's follower of Nagarjuna. But in the end, when you look in among the basis of imputation, that the base to which you're ascribing a certain identity, you should be able to find the thing that conventionally is that. And he was going to, there's a passage we'll look at, which is, the one where Bhavaveka supposedly makes this mistake of saying, here is what the person is conventionally. It's not that the person is, it's not that there's just this merely conventional relationship. It's that in a conventional sense, the cup is there among the base of imputation. It's not ultimately findable, but conventionally there is something in there that is the cup. So, in Tsongkhapa's way, the object of imputation, the thing that you're imputing, object of imputation, Jeffrey was trying to make this point on the video this week, that the object imputed is the cup, not the name cup. And that's important because the reason he's saying that is because there is this tradition of talking about this philosophy as nominalism or Mipham, mere names, and that is that, all we got is these words like cup, and it isn't the case that we're talking about words. We're talking about objects that exist. Objects exist as imputations. Also, my understanding is that Lama Sopa uses this word label mostly to talk about imputation now, which has a lot of virtues, right? But and it is based in Mipham, which is the word in the tradition. But the downside of it is it really seems to imply that we're talking about, like, well, there's a thing there already, and then we put one of those little labels on it, and it's not really like that. The thing, the cup, is constituted only as being an imputation, an ascription. And questions of names and so forth can be distinguished from that. So this makes a very different way of thinking about how the world exists. My teacher, Geshe Pelden Tarpa, brought this home to me when I said, well, yeah, everything exists conventionally, more or less as we already thought. For example, this table's made out of atoms. And he said, no, it's not. And I said, well, how can you possibly say that? We know that the table's made out of atoms. The table's not made out of atoms. There are atoms. They're conventionally ascribed to their appropriate bases of designation, and there are tables that are ascribed to their appropriate bases of designation. If you say the table's made out of atoms, that's in Tibetan, that's dul detruba, that it's like atomically established, and it's set up from its own side as a table by way of the compilation or concretization of certain collections of material bits. The table is made out of atoms. No, the table is imputedly existent. If it were objectively established as a table because some certain molecules had gotten together, then everyone would know that it was a table. Like if a bat came in the room, right, then the bat would say, oh, there's the table, because it would be objectively a table, right, and so forth, right? But it's not like that. Yeah, so anyway, that's how you see that this way of thinking of the world is actually different from how we usually think. So there are conventionally existent external objects in this system. That is, there's cups, there are tables that are not one entity with my mind. But different kinds of beings can have contradictory and equally correct perceptions of what is present, because things have no objective existence, or no way of being what they are naturally from their own side, right? So we were looking at the passage the other day about, gods and ghosts and humans, seeing in a certain place in time, this is nectar for one person and water for the other, pus and blood for the third, and that they're all correct. They're all correct because they all have unimpaired faculties. There's not like one of them is taken some bad drugs, or they all have unimpaired faculties that are just their natural faculties that they're equipped with, and they see these things appropriately from their point of view, but they contradict one another. And so this is like a way of realizing, I think, that this is like the thing about saying the table's not made of atoms, that this is not just our ordinary conventional way of, you have, everything's the same except we're going to subtract something we never believed in the first place, which is inherent existence. No, it's actually really different, because there are external objects out there, yet we can't say anything about what they are except in reference to the point of view of a certain kind of being, because from one being's point of view, this external object could be one thing, and from the other point of view, at the same time, same place, it could be something completely different and irreconcilably contradictory, right? Right, because it doesn't exist objectively as any particular thing. That's what it means to have no objectively real, no existence from its own side. So, as we've found out already, point 12, Contradictory is the system that Tsongkhapa follows, and that comes to be called, as we'll learn about tomorrow, the Prasangika Madhyamika, and as opposed to and distinct from Baba Viveka's system. All Madhyamikas, point 13, accept that all things are empty in the sense that nothing withstands ultimate analysis. I've said that above. That's the common Madhyamika view. Nobody rejects it. And that means, in a sense, that they all reject svabhava, or kind of a rangshin, the idea of some nature that would be findable under an ultimate analysis if it were there. But according to Tsongkhapa, Bhavaveka, and so forth, nonetheless accept, believe, claim that things have some, character from their own side, I guess I would have put, instead of intrinsic nature. That is, some way of they have some way of existing by way of their own character in a conventional sense. That there's something on the object side. And you can see why this would be, this isn't just some made up thing. There are actual people that I know who hold this exact view and argue for it. And the reason is because of the problematic aspects of the Prasangika view as I've been articulating. It's very difficult to explain what it means to talk about how everything can be only what it is in relationship to a certain point of view. Like, don't you want to say, like, we have intuitively feel that, like, if there's a cat and a hat in the room, it's not just dependent on whose point of view is involved. There's something that's different on the side of the cat from the hat. Like, on its own side, there has to be something different. Was it Venerable Jumpel was here before when I did the tenet system, and he decided he was a Swatantrika, and basically I think that was why. Was because, it's like, yeah, there has to be, from the object's own side, some distinctive character, right? You can see why that would be an important way, of something that we would strongly want to hold. And Tsongkhapa rejects it. At least it seems to be clear that he doesn't think that things have any way of existing by way of their own character or from their own side, even conventionally. So there's supposed to be a not in 14. This philosophical difference is not self-evident in the Indian texts. And that's why I'm here today, because Venerable Churjaran said, Guy, you should explain this to us, whether, Tsongkhapa got it right or not, which is, we'll see whether I can actually do that. But we'll circle around it anyway, see how close we can get. So Tsongkhapa infers this difference from a very, very close reading of Chandrakirti and Bhavaveka's arguments and their differences about a bunch of things, including how a Madhyamaka, should be arguing with someone who propounds that things are ultimately existent or essentially existent. Chandrakirti argues that we should be using what we call reductio ad absurdum type arguments, which is like consequences, contradictory consequences. They say, if you hold some wrong view, then it implies something else that's absurd. You say, so it follows that this utterly ridiculous thing has to be the case because you claim X, Y, Z. And that seems to be, a big part of the thrust of what Chandrakirti's saying, that that's the way we need to argue. We don't necessarily have to assert our own position in order to argue with the realist. Okay? When that leaves open the question of whether we can assert our own position or whether we have our own position. And so in Tsongkhapa's view, which is not unanimously held, this does not mean that Prasangikas have no view or position. In his view, they hold the view that things are empty of an intrinsic nature, even conventionally, as we've just explained, and that's a view and that's a position. And we can hold it, we can argue for it, and we can defend it, and we can try to realize it through meditative reasoning. The question is, is in his point of view, is not that we can't, the point isn't that we can't use this kind of reasoning. And it's something different. He's going to argue that, Chandrakirti's, Bhavaveka's insistence that we use some different kind of argumentation where we forcefully put forth our own claim and give reasons for it to someone who doesn't understand the world the way we do, implies that there's some kind of common apprehension of all the objects that we're arguing about. And there isn't, because we should be understanding them as having this false appearance, and the other person will taking them to be existing as they appear. So that's what we'll be getting into in more detail. Now, having gotten the basics out of the way, We come to Guy Newland's reading, which is provisional, started last year here, and improved, extended, and possibly improved, who knows, at Vajrapani, and then a little bit more lately. Things exist, but they have no way, even conventionally, of existing from their own side. So that means they exist as imputations or designations. It's easy to think about that or understand the gist of it by just considering the letter A, which is obviously like it's really easy to start with the letter A, as Jeffrey starts with in one of his books, The Tantric Distinction, right? Because like when you write the letter A up on the board, everybody sees, oh, there's a letter A, what's the professor going to say about it? But then you say, oh, well, you're just imputing that as a letter A. There's all these little marks here, and where do you find the letter A among them? There's no letter A on the side of the board in these lines. You're thinking that you're passively receiving the information of the A from the board, but it's not like that. You, as you can easily quickly recognize, are actually ascribing, imputing, assigning, this identity to some non-A collection of stuff that's up there, and we've learned how to A it all together, right? Yeah, and everybody can see that like so easily. It's like a joke, right? It's like, oh, it's like a little flip in my mind. It's over there, I'm receiving it, oh, but I also know that I'm sending it out, but then it seems to be that I'm not sending it out, it seems to be coming from over there, but it can't really be that it's naturally over there because we all agreed to make it up as that. And you know what I'm saying? You can just flip back and forth, and people can quickly see that there's a way in which, at least with letters, there's a way in which something that is out there in the world, is functioning, appears to be set up from its own side, has actually been constituted or ascribed or imputed from our side. And people can quickly understand that. The problem is then when you extend it and say, it's like that with mountains, it's like that with chariots. Chariots, who cares? Forests, nobody ever cares about chariots anymore. It used to be a big deal, now nobody cares. There's a lack of manifest afflictions in regard to chariots. Forests, maybe not so much. We don't. There's local knowledge here about forests, but then it gets really dicey when you come to the person, right? Nobody ever cares too much about the other things. With the person, then it's like. I'm making myself up, and then there's a strong sense that this is not the same kind of thing as talking about a letter A, right? But the system here is that it's exactly the same, and you can't produce any good reason why it shouldn't be. It's like you would prefer to not think of it that way. Yeah. So I did the thing about the atoms. The existence of things like the existence of atoms. Table is not made of atoms. Atoms and the table are all ascribed on the basis of a proper basis of designation, not the table or the atoms aren't established on their own side. Also, the basis of designation is also established only through being ascribed on the basis of designation, and imputing something to a basis of designation is not the same as in superimposing a false notion upon it. Oh. So I just thought I've added this in because it's clear that this becomes a huge source of confusion. I think it was even involved in the passage we were looking at the other day. So people confuse this idea of that objects exist as mere imputations. It sounds like, oh, that's bad. We're imputing something that we shouldn't be imputing, right? And then they confuse that with superimposing a kind of natural or real existence on things. So don't confuse that. Imputations is good. It's natural that we ascribe, that things conventionally exist as this or that because they exist as mere imputations, as this or that. That's how things exist, as imputations. The problem is that when we don't realize that they're imputations and we take them as being non-imputations, as being naturally set up as just over there without being imputed, that we could call superimposition. And sometimes, in the vocabulary, especially in English, I think, more than in Tibetan, then people get confused maybe between which is the good one and which is the bad one, right? It's natural for things to be imputed. That's how they exist. It's wrong to superimpose on them the idea that they're not imputed, but just exist without having to be. So fundamental ignorance is a mind that wrongly regards things and persons and have some other way of existing without having to be imputed, some way of existing from its own side. That means having some way of existing without depending on being designated in terms of how they appear from a certain point of view. That's my phrasing. And it's based on this boldface is directly from Lama Rinpoche Tsongkhapa. The fundamental wrong view is the subtlest wrong view is a conception that phenomena have some ontological status, that some way of being or mode of existence in and of themselves, wrong without being posited through the force of an awareness. Right? So, yeah, things exist only in relationship to... There are external objects, remember. It's not that everything's of one entity with the mind. There are external objects. But nothing, including all these external objects, exists, has its own way of existing without being posited through the force of an awareness. And thinking that they do is the basis of cyclic existence. Cyclic. Almost got it. So, therefore, to see things as they are, we must recognize that everything we see, everything we hear, somehow depends on designation by conventional consciousness. As I said, there are conventionally existent external objects. If people start explaining what imputation means in a way that undermines this, like it implies that somehow everything's of a nature with the mind, then you're not doing prasangika anymore. You're not following Chandrakirti. You could still be part of Madhyamaka depending on how you word it. Maybe you're a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka like Shantarakshita. So they're external objects that exist as mere imputations by the mind. Appearing to exist without needing to be imputed, in fact, objects exist only in dependence on imputation. Even conventionally, objects have no way of existing in and of themselves from their own side or by way of their own character. And therefore, they have no distinctive character within their own nature, even conventionally, which is disturbing because it means that, like, the cat and the hat don't have any distinctive character from their own side. That's where you sort of like, really? Maybe I should do the Bhava Viveka one? That's what Venerable John Pell was saying. Not just him, other people too. They can't say that they have any distinctive character from their own side, or you're not following the Chandrakirti Tsongkhapa way. So, how does this work? Conventionally, an external object, we know there are these external objects. It can be X from one point of view, Y from another point of view, Z from a third point of view, even when X, Y, and Z are all contradictory, as in the case of the gods, ghosts, and humans. Or if you're not used to thinking about gods, ghosts, and humans, then you can think about like humans and turkeys, or because we're here with the turkeys mostly. It's like they it's like, oh well, of course the turkeys don't see things around here correctly because they have those stupid turkey minds. The brains are only so little bit. Now that's like stupid, right? You haven't thought about it enough. They're very healthy turkeys. They're well fed and taken care of. They have all their turkey parts and their turkey eyes and their turkey brains are just the way they're supposed to be. So they see things exactly the way turkeys ought to see things, right? Most of them do anyway, right? And right. So they don't see things at all the way we do, and yet they're seeing them exactly correctly, right? That's the kind of thing like the gods and the ghosts and humans. They really actually see different things. Like I was at Vajrapani, there's a person who knew about animals there telling me that a blackbird does not see black when looking at another blackbird. I don't know how they know that. But she was quite certain that a blackbird does not see another blackbird. I think it's something wired up the blackbird's brain. And like obviously you get bats, spiders, all these other creatures. It's like they correctly see things in a radically different way. It's like, yeah. So then that's a suggestion of like, if all these different creatures are seeing things in a radically different way that are all correct, then that's a indication that even though things are out there, they're not naturally from their own side this or that. So I made this point, it's not a matter of one being having a more accurate view of the external object unless there's some superficial cause of error, like having taken LSD, then they all have, conventionally correct knowledge about what's there from their point of view. Now, up to there, I have a pretty high degree of certainty that I've explained it correctly. Now we start to go a little bit beyond that. Existing external objects do have diverse character that makes them either suitable or unsuitable for basis of designation for various objects. I'm going to say that. Why? I'm on point 9. I'm just saying, you have to be sure you read what I say and what I don't say. They're external objects that exist. They have some kind of diversity to them. But we're not svatantrikas, even though we recognize that we can acknowledge that external objects have some kind of diversity. Because none of these objects has any particular character as this or that from its own side, except in depending on its relationship to a certain perspective or mind. There isn't any objective, independent way to characterize what kinds of things are out there. You can only talk about what kinds of things are out there when you include in the equation, or the sentence, from such and such a point of view. Do you see what I'm saying? So the fact that we have to include such and such a point of view in order to talk about things does not mean that there aren't different kinds of things out there. There are different, not only are there things, Guy is going to posit, there are different kinds of things conventionally. What kinds of things? Depends on who's looking. How it depends on, what point of view, which is which. It's part of my attempt to make sense out of this. So the diverse character of external objects can be specified and characterized only relative to the perspective of a particular being. Yeah. Sure, we're almost. Yeah.
It said that makes them either suitable or unsuitable basis of designations for various objects.
From a point of view. Yeah.
That, it sounds like
they have the character on their own side.
Yes.
I know.
So I think you have to
put him from a certain point of view, even in there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or say that because it's only after they've been designated that then they have the characteristics that make a suitable designation for them.
No, I know. 9 sounds very svatantrika. Yeah. And what I was trying to do is make the point that it's not just that they're outside objects, but there have to be outside objects that are differentiable, that have, but they can't be, you can't talk about what those differences are except in any specific way, except in reference to a particular point of view.
The whole thing about saying that they're proper bases of designation.
I know.
Because that proper makes it sounds like there's something out there.
That makes them naturally suitable.
Yeah, it's suitable to be called as a hat because hat automatically means something that you put on your head.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, but no, I know, but okay, what I would want to do to correct it is just say suitable or unsuitable basis of designation for various objects from particular points of view. That's what I would want to do. Only merely change, not eliminate suitable or unsuitable, because that's where we're going to get as prasangikas the idea that it's correct to call this a hat and correct to call it a cat, but only qualify by making sure that even up front you're introducing the idea of relative to a perspective.
But it's only correct to call it a cat after all of us have agreed that cat is the label to give, is the designation to give to it. Before we all agree that, there's nothing in that makes it a proper basis to be for the sound cat to be applied to it.
Well, the sound cat.
The word designation cat.
Yeah.
Whether it's written or
thought
or spoken.
Okay, well, I'll have to think about that. I want to. Okay, so one of the reasons I'm always hesitant about that. I mean, it is sort of related to what Jeffrey was saying about distinguishing between words and names on the one hand and objects, which we call words and names as a way of expressing the idea that things are merely conventionally designated. So there's all kinds of creatures that are trapped in cyclic existence that don't form any agreements about anything, and don't have any words, don't have any language. But they're able to move around in the world and distinguish, this is food, this is danger, this is enemy. They may not think those words, but so they don't have words, but they're able to conventionally ascribe some kind of identity to this or that in a non-linguistic way. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's why I didn't want to like say, well, we have to all get together and use the word cat or something like that. Anyway, I get at least part of your point, though, for sure. I know that I wrote 9. When you read 9 in a bare way, it sounds Swatantrika. That's why I immediately went to 10. It was intentional. I wanted to make it clear that we have to make there have to be not just external objects, but unless you're a type of being from whose point of view there is absolutely no differentiation among phenomena whatsoever. Maybe there's some such being, right? But unless you're such a being like that you're continuously in a meditative equipoise of total non-discrimination or something like that, for every other kind of being, you have to say that there are certain things that it's certain kinds of external objects that from your point of view are suitable to be treated as X or Y. Whether you call them that in the sense of applying a name is a different question. That's what I was trying to get across. I'm running out of time. Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. Anyway, the diverse character of external objects can be specified and characterized only relative to the perspective of a particular being. 12. The existence of the buildings of the Abbey and so forth as a basis of designation for the Abbey is not existent on the side of the buildings. These buildings, etc., are such a basis of designation, depends on our point of view, is correctly not recognized from the butterfly's point of view. That is, it would be weird if the butterflies were, going, there's the Abbey, right? And then the other butterflies would think, you're tripping, which maybe would actually be the case if the butterfly could have such a thought, right? So, by the way, since I'm almost out of time, I would like to mention that some of the sources that I used to figure these things out, especially, for example, this point and some of the ones below, are in the widely published and read books by the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama's books, like, How to See Yourself as You Really Are, especially that one, but some of the other ones have embedded within them not just general introductions to practice, but reflections of his personal insights based on practicing this stuff. And I mean, he's when we say they're geishis and they're geishis, he's one of the ones who's really a deep thinker about these issues. And I think that, the way he posits things existing as mere imputations by thought is not the same as how every other Gelugpa Geshe would posit it. So I'm trying to figure out, how he's doing it or where he is in thinking about this as a guideline rather than looking at somebody else. Yeah.
Could you say that again?
The last sentence?
Just what you were just saying about, you're saying he's holding for Dalai Lama.
Oh, I'm saying.
It's your reference, and so you're looking at him as a reference as opposed to in
Well, I'm
the
saying.
context of the other Gelug.
Yeah, I know somebody sent me Gelugpa Geshe's manuscript that he, as a younger Tibetan, was translating into English, and he sent it to me. And it's very clear that this person not only disagrees with the interpretation I'm giving here, but they forcefully disagree with it and think it's totally wrong. I mean, you come to this question of what does it mean for a thing to be imputed by thought, and then everything's mere imputation by thought. Okay, so who's thinking about the tree falling in the forest? Who's thinking about the Big Bang? And you start, people ask these questions, and the questions haven't been well anticipated in the tradition, then people say different kinds of things about what actually imputation by thought means. And I mean, I think that the things that my particular Geshe Pelden Tokpa, Geshe Yeshe Tupke, who was here, have said things that for me seem to fit with the things that the Dalai Lama has said, but they're not the same as, like, I've had other teachers, not just like things that I've read from, who've said different things. Like, one of the answers is, you can't really talk about what it means for things to be mere imputations by thought, because when you try to analyze what it means for something to be a mere imputation by thought, that's ultimate analysis. And therefore, you never find anything. It's ultimately inconceivable what it means for things to be mere imputations by thought, so we shouldn't even, like, try to go there. I had people tell me that. Other people say, well, what does it mean to talk about the Big Bang as a mere imputation by thought? Well, Buddha was aware of it, and so it was a mere imputation from the point of view of an omniscient mind, right? Other people have said that. You don't, His Holiness doesn't say that, actually. So,
But has he said, how does he answer the question? I haven't heard that.
well, okay, so we're kind of out of time, but he says on page in 16, he says, some Geshes and others strongly imply that there must be a designating mind present, designating each object to be what it is, or else right before that moment when we cognize it as that. And in How to See Yourself as You Really Are, he says, to hold this view would be most uncomfortable, which is, no, right?
Yeah.
And people say that. People say that. That's what the Geshe whose manuscript I got from India just like 2 years ago, he said exactly that. And His Holiness says this is extremely uncomfortable. That's for things to exist as mere imputation by thought does not mean that that there's a thought going around each and every second, like imputing each thing and saying, oh yeah, that's a rug because just before it was a rug, I like made it up as a rug. And like you can't. It's like, oh, well, that sort of sounds okay when you're talking about the rug, maybe, but then you have it like all the bugs in the forest and so forth, and there's still bugs even when we're not thinking about them. So anyway.
Yeah, I've heard similar to you that His Holiness refuting that position.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard him say anything else instead.
Right. Well, not exactly. He says that, but then he says other things which are not 100% clarifying. So then I'm relying in the section right after that, 17, 18, 19, on things that come from Geshe Khyentse Yeshe Tupten, Geshe Pelden Tokpa, Geshe Yeshe Tupke, Alan Wallace. Because it seems to me that the things that they're saying are not inconsistent with what His Holiness says, although going farther and trying to be clear. Sticking their necks out a little further, which is what I was trying to do. So it is the time to stop, and what I will finish up those points and then go on to talk about, and then go on to like have more. Let's see. Oh yeah, we're moving quite quickly through, so we can. I'll finish up that, and then we can have questions in the afternoon at 2:30. Okay.